We have several real fine questions, and I believe it's going to be an interesting and exciting and challenging afternoon. I wasn't able to be on this lectureship, though invited the last couple of years because we were living in Florida, and I felt all year long that I'd missed something, missed an entire schedule. I love and appreciate this congregation. I've been here many, many times in many different ways. I've worked with the School of Preaching, taught in lectureships beside this. I've also been here many times in the summer in the adult Bible class and the family Bible school. And in many ways, I love and appreciate these brethren, this congregation, this work as much as any in the world. And I'm appreciative of the theme this year and the tremendous lessons we've heard. And if I were to say the one thing that has really caused rejoicing on my part, and I'm sure many others, is how many of these young men have done such a marvelous biblical work. There is nothing in the world that encourages older preachers more than to see a solid phalanx of young men come along that love the truth and preach the word. I've heard some of the finest lessons this week I've ever heard, and to be honest with you, many, many of them have been from the younger men. You can tell that they've studied, they've prayed about it, they've had the courage to present the truth. And many times we become so discouraged and pessimistic and negative in our outlook, we fail to count our blessings, and that's one of the greatest blessings of all. Everything isn't bad, brethren. There's a lot of good things, and that might be one of the very best of all the things. I've noticed the other men who have been in charge of Open Forum have taken the liberty to speak a little bit before they get to questions, direct questions, and to set forth some principles and thoughts that might undergird a new set of questions. In other words, they've taken occasion of opportunity to editorialize, and I hate to embarrass them by not doing that myself, so I humbly beseech you to hush and listen a minute. If you noticed, Eddie's voice has been a little husky and not as strong, and you know why? It's because he practices what he preaches. He got that microphone so close to his mouth, he swallowed it. And be operation Saturday morning early. This week, as through many days in the past, I would say the last 10 years, I've noticed, brethren, in lectureships and on other occasions, and where questions are asked, to go to what I believe are two extremes, neither one of which is right, in regard to the hub of the Bible, the central fact of the Bible. I've heard brethren on one hand say it's AD 70, the destruction of Jerusalem. I've heard others say, no, it's Acts chapter 2, the day Christianity began. I don't believe either one of those is the hub of the Bible. And I believe that people who are proponents of either side miss the point, and that's part of our imbalance. The hub of the Bible is not the day of Pentecost. It's the death of Christ. There would have been no effectual nature of the preaching on Pentecost had it not been for what he preached, Christ and him crucified. In fact, through the years I've heard people say the punchline in Acts 2, the crux of the matter, the high crescendo point is verse 38. Verse 36, brethren. Had it not been for the truth enunciated in verse 36, there had been no meaning to verse 38. Therefore, let all the house of Israel know assuredly, God hath made that same Jesus whom you have crucified, both Lord and Christ. Now when they heard this, they were pricked in their hearts and cried out and said, men and brethren, what shall we do? The response to that question, repent and be baptized for the remission of sins, is not only essential, valuable, powerful, rich, but it's based upon the real hub of the Bible. Everything in the Old Testament pointed to the death of Christ, and everything since then has pointed back to it. And I've said all that to say this. I believe the greatest single need in the church today by preachers of every age is to preach Christ more, to exalt Christ more. If those of us who are conservative, and most of us here will freely admit we are and are thankful we are and don't intend to change, but if those of us who were noted for being conservative were also the most people who exalted Christ, his love, his teaching, his death, his perfect example, I believe some people would sit up and take notice. But if all we ever do is expend time talking about what's wrong here and wrong there and how many brethren are apostatizing and everything else, we have lost the mooring, the core and circumference of Bible preaching ourselves. And if we base our whole tenet upon exalting Christ, His church, His word, and truly manifest a deep-seated love and loyalty for Him, then everything we say outside of that sphere will be listened to better, will be applied more properly, and will be the Christ-centered, Bible-based, God-honoring, heaven-bound preaching that the whole world needs. I plead with all of us to be more balanced in that regard in our preaching. Having said that, we are not in any way saying we shouldn't expose error. We should expose all of it, courageously, without fear of favor, without equivocation, without compromise. But it must come from, in other words, what's the purpose of defending the faith? It's the center of that faith, Jesus Christ. We don't want His life, His teaching, His emphasis besmirched. And when people realize that's our motivation, that's where we're coming from, I believe we'll raise up a generation of people who are more balanced, who are more loving, and who really enjoy themselves more. There isn't anything worse in all the world than a fellow that's only known for what he's against. We need to preach Christ and Him crucified, that our faith would not stand in the wisdom of men, but in the power of God. 1 Corinthians 2, 1-5. And really, I would like some comment on that in a few moments. I'd like for us to see if we can't be balanced in this appeal for balance. Then, another thing that I'd like to mention, and would really appreciate some comment on this, because I believe it's something we don't touch on very often. And we're in a unique position today to do something about this point. For years and years, I have believed, not just for personal quirk's sake, but in observation and in reading the New Testament and teaching 1 and 2 Timothy and Titus in many of the schools of preaching, I've observed that we do not have enough camaraderie between older preachers and younger preachers. We don't have enough Paul and Timothy relationships. And yet there's nothing in the world richer or finer or more needed. What can we do to cultivate an unselfish, loving, devoted relationship between older preachers and younger preachers? I was blessed as a young preacher to have some of the finest preachers in the brotherhood, by anybody's standards, however you rated outstanding preachers, to be some real dear friends of mine, to take time to help me, to be patient with me, to open up their libraries, their notebooks, their sermon outlines, their encouragement, their experience, their knowledge. I could not tell you how valuable that was. And yet I've also known some preachers that were so selfish and so paranoid that they wouldn't even let anybody in their office. They wouldn't even let the man who cleaned the building in their office. I don't know what they thought he was going to do, you know. Probably good if they had any good sermons, it'd probably been good if he had stolen an outline, if he was going to steal something, you know. But the point I'm making is we do need, this is not just a trivial matter. We need to work out ways that older, more experienced preachers can help younger preachers. And we also need, when we have Bible studies with them, to let them talk too. We can learn something from them. And so I want us to be thinking about what we can do to help in that regard. Then I'd like for us to have a little session here in a few moments. We'll probably get to specific questions, then come back to this. But I want to sow some seed here for you to be thinking so your response will be more productive. And I hope you won't forget about these points by that time. It'd be like the two fellows that met on the street. And one of them said, I came by your house last night. And he said, why didn't you honk? And he said, I didn't know where you lived. And he said, well, I saw you. He said, why didn't you holler? And he said, I didn't know it was you. So I've been meeting some folk that had that kind of memory. But I'd like for us to have a little discussion on how to get the most out of Bible study. What can we do when we sit down with an hour here and an hour there, or maybe a half a day, to get the maximum out of the time we're spending with the projected notion of learning more about the Bible? Why is it, in other words, that some people have been to Bible class every Sunday for 50 years still don't even know the books of the Bible in order? Why is it so many of us couldn't write a one-paragraph summary of the 66 Bible books one after another, though we've been to Bible class all our life? What can we do to get the most out of Bible study? What are some good rules, guidelines for richer, more productive Bible study? And then the last point I want us to discuss, and this probably is of the maximum import and thus benefit, if we'd really be fair and honest and get into this in an unbiased way and in a Christian manner. And that is, how can we develop less suspicion and more brotherly love in the body of Christ? One thing I've observed in the last 5 years more than ever before are brethren who seem absolutely intent upon being suspicious of everybody but themselves. What can we do to develop and cultivate among those of us who are conservative a less vicious, more brotherly spirit, lest we bite and devour one another and be consumed one of another? And those are not my words, but Paul's, inspired of the Holy Spirit in Galatians 5:15. Now, these are vital matters. We're not talking about whitewashing sin. We're not talking about overlooking error. We're talking about attitudes. The Bible teaches that God loved us when we were yet sinners. There's a pattern. We need to develop more brotherly love. Would we really like to extricate those that differ with us and don't cross every T and dot every I, that are still nonetheless conservative and love the Word and have proved it by their life? What can we do to develop less suspicion and more brotherly love, that the cause of Christ might be honored and that we might begin to answer the prayer Jesus prayed in John 17 and avoid the division that Paul condemned in the church at Corinth, not in the denominational world as we usually use and maybe misuse that passage? Are we endeavoring to keep the unity of the Spirit in the bond of peace? Are we in meekness and long-suffering and forbearance, following the injunction of Ephesians chapter 4? Or are we so ready in our suspicious attitudes to cut and slash and go to print against somebody, when maybe if we took them under the wing of love and exhort them and love them as a brother, we might save a brother, save a rift, mend the body of Christ? That at least would be noble aspirations, wouldn't it? Let's have a little discussion of that in a few moments. Now, lest you think I'm afraid to answer these questions, you know I hadn't got enough sense to avoid them. Here is a real good question. I'm not going to read it all because it really becomes a little bit involved, but I know I'm going to get to the spirit of it, and it will be representative of not just one person in one place with one problem, but of many of us in many places through the years. How do you help a member who has been hurt deeply by a brother who also is an elder? Hurt so deeply to the point of not wanting to or being afraid to turn to the other elders. And then it goes on to say the concept of even being disheartened to attend there anymore and feel like that people are looking at us and watching us. And whether it be true or not, the concept that it seems that people are suspicious of us and being critical of us, and we've been disappointed and hurt. If I hadn't heard this same thing for 40 years, nearly everywhere I've ever been, I wouldn't have answered this question. So we're not answering the specific words of that specific person, but the principle as it applies to all of us. For instance, I've heard people say, Brother so-and-so hurt my feelings in an adult Bible class in Possum Trot in 1938, and I'm never going back to adult Bible class. That makes a lot of sense, doesn't it? To the devil. Whoever said that teacher was your guide and standard anyway? Paul said, follow me as I follow Christ, 1 Corinthians 11:1. We can't let anybody get between us and the Lord. We've got to be smarter than that. People who say, I'm going to quit if they don't get another preacher. Then someone else says, and if they get another one, I'm going to quit. Remember the story of the preacher was leaving, and this old woman was standing out in the vestibule crying her eyes out, and he said, sister, don't cry. They'll get a better one than me. And she said, that's what they said the last time. So we have problems when we center our religion around people, against individuals, against human beings. We've got to remember that in the day of judgment, fortunately, the Lord, with His Word, will judge us. In fact, we won't even judge ourselves in the sense that we may have deceived ourselves and think we're better than we really are. Whereas others may assess us as being worse than we are, we may think we're better than we are. Fortunately, we'll be before the all-seeing eye of the heart searcher, Acts 1:24. And the eyes of the Lord are in every place, beholding the evil and the good, Proverbs 15:3. Neither is there any creature that is not manifest in His sight, But all things are open and naked before the eyes of him with whom we have to do. Hebrews 4:13. And Hagar cried truthfully, thou, O God, seest me. Genesis 16:13. And he sees us as we really are, and one day we'll stand before him. We won't stand before this elder or preacher or Bible teacher disappoint us. Therefore, our life must be bereft of the pettiness, the littleness, the foibles, the trials, the duress that sometimes we impose upon ourselves because of what we think of what other people think of us. So my answer to this question, and to any like it, representing many, many other people in many other places, is to serve God with an undivided allegiance. 1 Corinthians chapter 4 has helped me about as much in the last 5 or 10 years as any passage in the Bible. 1 Corinthians 4, 1-5, Paul said, brethren, what you think of me and what I think of myself is not very important. It's what the Lord thinks of me that counts, because I'm his steward. I'll give answer to him. Preachers are legion who say, the brethren mistreated me and they fired me because I preached the truth. Could have been the way they preached it. Maybe they got an ugly attitude between the people out in the pew and the message from the book. There have been a lot of fellows who had to leave because they didn't have the sense God gave a blind goose going backwards. But the point is, we can't allow ill treatment, true or imagined, to keep us from putting God first and being a faithful Christian. And what does the Bible say about loving our enemies and doing good to those who despitefully use us and showing kindness to those whom we think are unkind to us? We just need the practice of genuine Christianity and quit waiting for the other fellow to start being a Christian and us to be one before he is. And again, we'll open that up for discussion. One other, and then we will pause and give you opportunity, and then we'll come back. I want us to cover every one of these questions if we possibly can, and these comments. How far must a church digress before we cease to call them brethren? That might be one of the most difficult questions in the world, because if I'm supposed to answer until October 17th, 1991, I won't be able to do that. That's a hard question, because motives, intent, the people themselves, the situation, our endurance factor, all these things enter. I'd rather turn it around and say, can we not help a church heading in that direction to stop and make a U-turn? But there does come a time when Romans 16:17 has to be obeyed. Mark them that cause offenses, contrary to the doctrine you have received, and avoid them. How long are we to be patient? I remember one time a lady said, you got to be patient. My husband, he's just been a member of the church 15 years. I've heard that, and I know Harold has, and others. When was it they were going to start growing up? This morning I was privileged to record a TV program for the TV program Truth and Love this congregation has. And I chose to speak on the book of Hebrews, exalting Christ. One of the hardest jobs I ever had was to reduce 13 brilliant chapters to 23 stumbling minutes. But and in that, in Hebrews chapter 5, I believe we have the sternest single direct rebuke in all the epistles in the New Testament. For when, for the time you ought to be teachers. And you know what he says? He says, you're a big bunch of babies, still drinking milk when you ought to be on strong meat. So he didn't leave them alone. He exhorted them. He rebuked them straightforwardly. I don't believe there's anybody that can give a time on this. It just ought to make us work more energetically, more zealously to do something about it. How far must a church digress before we cease to call them brethren? I do make this one cautionary statement that I always get in trouble with, because I differ with some folk on this point. I'm still studying, is it right or proper or scriptural for one church to withdraw from another church? I have no doubt we're to mark false teachers wherever they are. But in Revelation chapter 3, one of the sorriest congregations ever existed, the Lord nevertheless said, you have a few names there that have not defiled their garments. I wonder if it's possible to ever withdraw from a whole church. I know we can mark the error that's being taught by a congregation, but how about babes in Christ? How about people who have nothing to do with the error? How about people who have no way to go anywhere else? Should every righteous person bail out? And we're not talking, someone said, well, how about if instrumental music's been introduced? That's no longer the church of the Lord. We're not talking about that. But it's something to study and think about. But we must mark error. We must point it out. All right, let's open it up now, and I believe I'd like for us to first of all discuss this point, and I do not want anybody to bring up a personal issue and say at a certain location located 21st and 9th and Avenue and so forth and call somebody's name. We're talking about the principle embedded in this answer about the person who's disappointed and hurt by another member of the church, and it's affecting their effectiveness as a Christian. Can you think of some guidelines and some other passages and thoughts that would help in that regard? Let's start on that one, and we'll not spend as much time as we have in other days on each one of these, but any comment on that? Anything we did not? Raise your hand, and they'll bring you the microphone.
I'm Bill Morgan from Elam Road in Dallas. One reason I definitely wanted to talk about this is I've had a little experience that was very heartwarming. When I was in a certain state going to college, I found out that a brother wasn't going to church services, and I finally got another fellow to go with me, and we went a second visit to this fellow. And this young man was from Freda Hardman, a preacher, and we talked to this elderly man. He hadn't been to church in 10 years, and we found out by just heart-to-heart talk that everything was a misunderstanding. Now, that's one thing that happens sometimes. A brother gets his feelings hurt, it's just a misunderstanding, just didn't get together. Another time, I was with some people, church, that there's a lot of hard feelings, gossip, even the preacher was involved a little bit in hard feelings with some of the people. We just got together with a dinner, and I wanted the brethren to meet while they were eating. You know, they kind of relax while they're eating. They relax, and the feelings they have, the fears and the things kind of go away when you're eating. But they didn't want to do that, so we got together right after we ate. That's just about the next best thing. You got a full stomach and kind of happy. And I started out kind of as chairman of this and getting everybody to kind of confront one another, but still not use any too strong of words. They got a little stronger as we went along, and somebody actually admitted there'd been some gossip, but nobody seemed to have their feelings hurt too much, and got the ones that were having their feelings hurt, and had a large number of the men for the congregation, practically 100% there. And I just couldn't hardly believe how well this turned out, because we got people confessing that, this is what they'd heard, and that maybe that wasn't true, and a lot of things weren't true. Well, anyway, to make this long story a little shorter, it just worked out, and everybody seemed so happy and so to actually confront the thing. And here's one thing we need to watch. I heard this coming over today on a radio program. There's what you call, especially in a family, a hate-love relationship. Well, in the brotherhood, maybe sometimes it's a fear-love relationship. We're mixing up our emotions a lot. We're thinking emotionally. Right. And you get this kind of a psychological twist, and you got your whole system kind of twisted up. Right. And on these people on the radio said, well, when you have a hate-love relationship, there's only one thing to cure this and help it, and that's to confront that person. Right. And there's a fear, well, if I confront them, they'll hate me more. Well,
Brother Morgan, I think we'd both agree that one of the big problems is what you mentioned first there, and that is a misunderstanding. Yeah. A lot of times when there's a falling out between brethren and we get right down to it, we find there's a misunderstanding. I heard a story that I thought illustrated this misunderstanding real well. A cowboy came upon an Indian with his ear right down on the ground. And he went up to him and he said, what are you doing there, Indian? He said, Indian tale of covered wagon, 4 strong horses, woman in calico dress, 3 children in the back of the wagon, man in a black suit, a gray beard, a white hat. He said, you mean with your ear on the ground you can predict that's coming? He said, Indian, speak of wagon that ran over him early this morning. So sometimes when we get the misunderstanding out of the way, there's no problem. All right, let's go to the next one now. Anybody else? Raise your hand right down here. Thank you.
I'm Graham Kane, member here at Brown Trail. Johnny, I thought that question you had to do with a supposed case where the offended party had been hurt by an elder. Is that right? I was just wondering if there might be some thought in the mind of the one that turned that in that would be a problem over and above being offended by someone else. I think that the Lord's teachings in Matthew 18 would apply to anyone, whether he was an elder or not, and the brother could go to that person, regardless of what his status was, and talk to him. And if that could not be worked out, then to go through the additional procedural steps outlined there with witnesses and so on, and if necessary, before the church.
I do believe sometimes we have an aura just over the word elder, and on one hand, some believe that they're infallible or cannot be questioned, and others are really more sensitive to supposed weaknesses or real weaknesses of men who are called elders. And as Brother Kane has brought out, it's very important that we apply, that we're not respecters of persons on these principles too, whatever a man, elder, deacon, preacher, whoever else. All right, any other comment on this? There's another down here. Now you have to raise your hand pretty high for me. I'm about half blind.
I'm Fred Johnson from Rowlett Church in Rowlett, Texas. There's one thing that we need to watch out for in this situation. Most people, when this comes up, they leave and go somewhere else to worship. And the scriptures teach that when we bring our gift to the altar, if we have aught against a brother, we leave the gift and go make it right. If we go somewhere else to worship and think we're pleasing God, he's not listening to us or not accepting our worship until we make it right with those where the problem is.
And according to that passage in Matthew 5, about 26, 27, we've done that fellow an injustice who may not even know that he's offended us. That's the tragedy of it. I remember years ago in Odessa, where I lived for 4 years and preached the gospel, a man was out of duty for some time, and we went to him, and to our amazement, he turned to me and he said, "You're the reason I'm out of duty." And I said, "Ken, what are you talking about?" And he said, "You remember what you said?" And he called up something that happened a year and a half before, what I said to another brother who was one of that man's good friends and one of my best friends too. And I said, "Ken, would you state that again? And I'll call this brother in." And I said, "He's going to be as amazed as I am." But for a year and a half, this fellow had been unfaithful to the Lord because he misunderstood something that I had said. Not that I haven't said wrong things, but that wasn't one of the occasions. I said, "Do you understand, Ken, that Bill and I are still the closest of friends and have always been?" I said, evidently he didn't think I was being offensive to him or unkind or unbrotherly. That never dawned on him. But there for a year and a half, we didn't know, he didn't tell. Once we knew, it took us about 5 minutes to clear it up. So that's something we need to always remember. One other comment on this, and then we go to another one. Anybody else? That's good, Matthew 5. Back to back there, please, right back behind you, about 3 rows.
Is there a possibility that I'm Joe Roten from Forest Hill?
Yeah, there's a possibility that you're Joe Roten. You look very much like him to me.
No, you got your glasses on. Now take them off. No, really, is there a possibility that two people can go to worship constantly without sometime another one offending the other? Doesn't the Bible teaches us that turn the other cheek? Doesn't the Bible say forgive him if you have aught against anybody? Why is it that we have to worry about somebody offending us? Maybe we're just looking for something to offend us. Just like this. The other day I went in down Sam's, waited for this man to back out so I could park in that place. And when he backed out, here came a lady and pulled right in front of me. I'm not going to Sam's anymore.
And if they knew that they were losing $1.13 every time you came there, they'd do something about that. All right, now let's go to this other question for a discussion. We can't make it too long, but I do want us to give notice to it. How far must a church digress before we cease to call them brethren? I know there'd be some that would like to make comment on that or other observations, or make the question even more difficult than it already was. Anybody? You got to raise your hand, Brad. I guess we satisfied everybody on that. Let's see if someone else, Bill, before we pass it back around, let's have a little opportunity to spread out. Anybody else like to comment on that? Back over here in this corner. Why don't you walk over to the microphone, Dave, if you will. Oh, you have one? Okay, good.
One, yeah. Dave Miller with Brown Trail. I think you're right, Johnny, that there will always be some people that do not side with the apostate element that may begin to take hold in the church. And certainly we would want to manifest concern for those people and be careful how we handle them. But don't you think that the tone and tenor of biblical history is that there does reach a point at which a group of people have manifested a general trend in the wrong direction, whether it be the nation of Israel, or I'm thinking, for instance, in Numbers chapter 16, where Korah, Dathan, and Abiram tried to mount a rebellion. And when it was over with, God said, or when it came to a head, God said, tell everyone to get away from the tents of those three men and their families. I've often thought about that. That doesn't seem fair. There are some innocent children there, some wives. Why is it that God was, kind of putting them all together into one ball of wax? Well, it's clear to me that whenever God said get away from their tents, those wives or those children could have done the same, but they were actually silently siding with what was going on there, and consequently were swept away in that whole situation. So surely there comes a point, even though there would be brethren who would not adopt the tendencies of churches that have clearly shown a propensity for going to the left, that must come to grips in their own mind with to what extent they want to continue to be affiliated with that which displeases the Lord.
I don't believe there's any question but what that's a perfect parallel and a great point, and I concur with it. I do believe, but because of innocent people, though, that when such a line of demarcation is drawn, we ought to have a paragraph in the letter somehow making it possible for them to realize that there is a place to come and there is a stand to take, and that we're not militantly, aggressively trying to point them out and say every single member there goes along with every single thing here that's in error, but make an appeal, as you said, for them to also come out and take a stand. That's a great point.
Absolutely, and also to make the point that probably who is spearheading this matter would be either the preachers or the leadership in some form or fashion. So there would be the brunt of our focus, with the understanding that there are members who have gone along with that, but perhaps some who haven't.
And that, in view of Romans 16:17, does say mark those who, in essence, teach error. So we're in no way saying not to do that. I think that's a good balancing comment, and I appreciate it. Any other comment on this? All right.
Richard Massey from Kennedale. I believe you can withdraw fellowship from a congregation because we've done that, and not simply because we've done that, but to have fellowship with another congregation is just like having fellowship with anyone else. 2 John verse 9 through 11. If they're not in fellowship with God, how in the world could we have fellowship with them? There comes a point in time when false doctrine that they're teaching and promoting interrupts that fellowship that they have with God, and thus that also causes the interruption of fellowship that we have with that congregation.
Yeah. Anybody else now? Let's pass it around if we can, Bill, and if not, will you take her again? All right, back.
Bill Morgan again. I'll try to be brief, but brethren, we just must be loving and patient. But I believe with all my heart that sometimes, we just are not open and frank enough. If we have an opportunity, we need to take that opportunity. And I will go back to Eaton, Ohio, where the Christian church was. It called itself the Church of Christ. W. Ray Duncan, some of you know W. Ray Duncan, got me in there while I was in the service to preach for him 2 Sundays. Well, I was very embarrassed because I had never even hardly visited a Christian church, let alone as a young man in the service knowing what to preach or what to do. So driving up there, it was about 30 miles, I made up my mind on the way up there I was going to tell them I couldn't sing with them. Now that's being awfully brave, but I was a young man, remember that. I'm a little older now. But I stuck my neck out and told them right at the very beginning before I preached, as I stood up there to preach, that I couldn't sing with them. But I didn't preach against instrumental music. I figured it wouldn't do any good. But I just preached the gospel, and I wanted to see what would happen. I just trusted in the Lord. I was supposed to come back the next Sunday, so I did. There's an old man that was an elderly man. I shouldn't say an old man, an elderly man. He was an elder, and he was one of the disciples in the independent church group. Kind of opposed him a lot, but, the friction was there. And he got up and called me, even though I had a uniform on, he kind of roundabout way said, well, there's the Japanese we're fighting and the Germans we're fighting, and we have one among us. That was me. Well, that just made some of them pretty hot. So anyway, I came back the next Sunday, though, and preached one more time. And then, I couldn't hardly believe it, but I came back after I got out of the service, and I'd sent the two families the Gospel Digest, corresponded, to free. I sent it to them myself. Okay, so anyway, came back. I couldn't believe the Sunday after I was there, they voted on whether they should have instrumental music or not because of what I said. And they voted 50-50. And one of the deacons had voted for the piano, his mother changed her vote. One woman changed her vote. And then one of the women that I'd been home with for dinner from Kentucky, and they called it the Christian church there in Kentucky, and she hadn't been there very long. She said, as far as I'm concerned, they can throw the old piano out in the street. I couldn't hardly believe that they would do that.
What was the end result of that? We need to get to that.
Just two families left there, but Brother W. Ray Duncan was supposed to come up and talk to them about Walnut Hill Church in Cincinnati supporting me full time, and they wouldn't even have to pay me and let me preach for them without using instrumental music. And they had a meeting before he got there and cut him off and wouldn't let him talk.
But at least you sowed some seed there.
But I'm just saying, there's every case. What I'm saying is every case is different. We just must be careful.
Right.
You'd never think there were such loving people as there were some of those people in that Christian church there.
All right, the brother there in the back. Didn't someone back there want to? If you'd come on down to the microphone, it'd help us here. Thank you.
I'm Asa Kill, and I visit full-time in the hospitals, and over the past year I've visited over 500 who put down Church of Christ that don't attend at all anymore, and some of them have been offended. Then I visit these in the hospital that have come in from smaller towns in West Texas, all over the country, to live with their children. They're in the area of very elderly, can't get around, can't hear, they're in the hospital, and yet they attend congregations that we would call liberal. And to disfellowship these people or these circumstances is difficult for me to know. I don't know, I'm caught up in this situation. I don't know what to do in some of these areas. I just do what I can for them,
I understand. That's what I had in mind too. People who are totally, absolutely innocent of any of the error and so forth. We have time for just one more brief statement right next to you there.
Johnny Gobble Music. I'm wondering if the question could be reread. I may have not listened well enough, but it seemed like the word brother should have an adjective in front of it. Once a child of God, always a child of God. It's not saying once saved, always saved. Now, you're the child of your mother. No matter what you do, you're still the child of your mother. But that doesn't mean that she cannot disinherit you. So once saved, always saved is not this. The branch can be in the vine and be dead. John 15:1-8.
Whereas it can be erring brethren.
Yes, unfaithful brother might be considered better or an erring brother than just saved brother.
Right.
Because they're always going to be brothers.
Right.
They might be disinherited, but they're still a brother.
All right, but it doesn't have it on here, but that's a good point and a good comment. Appreciate it. All right, now to another question. We've had two or three along this same line. One is worded, what about women leading singing, such as small groups or choruses in the assembly or where the congregations come together? And make some comment about the a cappella singing group, not those who sing a cappella, but the group called a cappella that is mimicking instruments of music and so forth. Number one, back of all of this, I'd have to say we need to rethink the purpose of worship to start with. It is not to entertain. It's not to please us. is not to meet our desires. The purpose of worship is to glorify God. God made us for his glory, Isaiah 43:7. Worship the Lord in the beauty of holiness, give God the glory due his name, 1 Chronicles 16:29. There's no question but what teachers of the New Testament and lovers of truth conclude unanimously that the Bible teaches women are not to lead in the assembly, in any phase of the assembly. Whether that's archaic or whatever else it is, it's still Bible. And for people to try to push women into roles insignificantly and then push them a little farther into more significant roles is a violation not only of direct Bible teaching, such as 1 Timothy 2:9-12, but is a violation of the spirit and ethics and the purpose and nature of worship to start with. I would go back beyond this. I guess I'm almost odd man out. I'd go back beyond this and ask, where's the authority for special choruses and groups in the first place, led by anybody? That'd be my first question. Where is the disruption of or perversion of congregational singing, where we in unison worship God in spirit and in truth, John 4:24? By what right do we coax people in by entertainment specials? About 10 years ago, brethren began having, quote, campaigns. That's more than a gospel meeting. That's a bigger name and more production. And so to begin the session, we'd have some entertainment, some brethren would say, to get the people in and to relax them, so we'd have special singing groups. And we began to mimic the choirs of denominationalism. We'd even have robes on those specialties. We're doing something different, something special. Let's just really make it different and special. And let's ape the sectarians and try to outdo them in our production numbers. Let's entertain the people. It's never been the purpose of New Testament Christianity. Never been the purpose of assembly worship. So I'd have to go back beyond even a woman leading singing in a small choir or chorus or group or whatever. And as to a cappella and things similar to that, people who mimic the sounds of mechanical instruments of music, that to me is just seeing how very close to the devil's work and service and offering we can get. We just need to back up and discuss the motive, the purpose. And I'll tell you where the seed of all of it was sown. We just got to be honest about it. Brother Brownlow was extremely honest in his speech the other day about, you did run well, what did hinder you? I want to be very honest too. Every bit of this stuff started with the youth movement, the youth rallies, the youth ministers. And we've got to have a glorified babysitter that we pay to do our work for us as parents, and turn the church into a gymnasium movement and think it's the work and purpose of the church to hire men to take our kids to Six Flags and to the Colorado ski slopes. The church of the Lord was never, ever in the entertainment business. Never has been, never will be. That's not why Jesus left heaven and came to earth. Wonder why he didn't come and build playgrounds and accommodate the felt needs of all the people. So to me, this is but an outgrowth, brethren, of problems we instituted a long time ago, which reflect upon our spiritual laziness and our failure to train and develop our young people to be servants of God. I don't know of anything that has hurt the thrust of Christianity more than what I really call an innovation, and that's the youth movement that started about 15 years ago, I'd say, and became very earnest in its enthusiasm about 10 years ago. I've met very, very few of the folk involved in that work that know 1 inch worth of the Bible. They're just shallow as can be in Bible. If they were otherwise, they wouldn't be in what they're in. And the way to save anybody, whether they're 14 or 40, 50 or 100, is with direct Bible preaching. So I'd have to go back beyond those questions to something that's even deeper that help produce the problems that those questions initiate. Yes, Gary. Get Brother Workman a microphone, please. Incidentally, was that plain enough for anyone that asked that? Did you understand that? I hope I don't have to explain it again, because that was so eloquent I can hardly stand it.
Johnny, while we're naming background influences, I think you ought to go ahead and be a little bit more bold and name some schools that got involved in things like that led to influences. Even though schools have done a lot of good in a lot of places, there has, for years and years, I don't know how far back this would go, but been the idea that a school is somehow exempt from the rules that apply to everybody else. In other words, it would be wrong to bring an instrument of music in, let's say, into a worship assembly in a local congregation, but we'll crank up the piano in the auditorium at the school, and we'll get the school chorus up there and sing Handel's Messiah along with that piano, and that'll be all right. It's a spiritual song, but this is a school, so the rules don't apply to us. What about that? And we have some around in this Metroplex area that are fostering that sort of thing.
In regard to that, what about this? You know, we can do it here, but can't do it there. It reminds me of a game we played when I was a little boy when we were playing Cowboys and Indians. And I'd have been dead by the time I was 6, because I had so many of those Indians shoot at me. But just as they aimed that imaginary bow and arrow at me, I said, King's X, tick-a-lock all around, you can't get me, and I lived another day. And that's really about what some of the brethren do. King's X, tick-a-lock all around doesn't apply to me. But there isn't any doubt but what we have. And another, we can just add even to that, how about brethren who would never, ever allow an instrument of music here as we sing spiritual songs, but they'll go home and do the same thing at home, but they wouldn't do here. As if worship is geographic and diocesan and holy, sacred building instead of a direct relationship with God. If we're the same person and He's the same God and we're singing the same song, we have no more right to add mechanical accompaniment one place or another. An inconsistency across the board, and it's a failure to understand the nature and purpose and thrust of worship and that communion with God. Any other comment on this? Raise your hand up so people can get here. We have some here and some back there. Just a minute. Bobby, go ahead.
In connection with that, I'm asking a question. What about instrumental music at a wedding? We have a wedding at a church building. You have a sermon. You have a prayer that's included. The songs are not what we would call religious songs, but would it be allowed to use the instrument with those non-religious songs at a wedding?
Not here, Eddie said. I really believe that a lot of times brethren not only are answering a question about a specific point, but they're answering how they feel about being safe, influential, helpful, and not destructive of the purity of the church of the Lord. I still believe that principle abides. That even if some could make a pseudo argument that sounded fairly logical, the end result of that, knowing human nature, would not stop there. My question would be, why do it? What would be the real ultimate good of it? There are a lot of things like this that we've let a crack come in the door, and pretty soon all the cattle have knocked down the door. And so there's a principle that we used to enunciate more often than we do now. So my answer, Bobby, on that would be to apply that point. Could we not have that wedding without it? Why would a person want to cause doubt and consternation in the minds of people we're trying to teach? When I preached at Meadowbrook years ago in Fort Worth, we had some good friends who were pretty good about bringing their neighbors, their next-door neighbors, and neighbors across the street and so forth with them, but they never were able to convert any of them or reach any of them, and I found out one night why they were having trouble with their neighbors next door, because they would teach them about the evil and error of mechanical instruments, music, and worship, and then go home to the church house and open up their windows where there's almost in the other folks' living room and do the very thing they taught their neighbors in a Bible class you shouldn't do. So inconsistency is a real problem. Don, you have a comment, please?
I've heard and have also presented the argument from Ephesians 5:19, and Colossians 3:16 concerning the use of instrumental music, that if that did condone it, not that it does, but if it did, it would demand that every one present would be playing an instrument. Now, if that's a proper argument, I believe it is, why would not the same principle demand that everyone present be singing? And I speak of course, in the case of the quartet or the choir or whatever. Either we have misapplied that argument or we fail to be consistent in our application of that principle that we see in those verses.
Right.
And I guess the question, is that a valid comparison, and do the verses I speak of teach that or not?
Well, if it says speaking to yourselves in psalms and hymns and spiritual songs, and one of those solo means an instrument, it'd include everybody in that injunction. We have another one right here, I believe. Rob Tompkins, right down here. Right behind you, Rob. Thank you.
Rob Tompkins, Wolf City. Johnny, this, to me, only scrapes at the surface of a much deeper problem that goes a whole lot deeper than we ever like to think, I believe. For example, if in light of 1 Corinthians 14, where Paul says, let the women keep silence in the churches, and in 1 Timothy 2, of course, the one that you alluded to a minute ago, if they want to learn, ask their husbands at home, 1 Corinthians 14, and also I suffer not a woman to teach. At what point can we separate the worship from a period when we can let the women be open and take a part actively? Is there a point? Have we been wrong scripturally all these years in separating the Bible study from the worship and making a point at which they can speak and a point at which they cannot?
Well, first of all, Rob, in applying 1 Timothy 2, 9 to 12, which is far more embracive and age-abiding principle everywhere in the assembly, in the Bible class, anywhere else. Any time and any place that a woman puts herself in a category of usurping authority over a man, teaching over a man, or usurping authority over a man, she's out of place. Therefore, in a Bible class, in other words, we know 1 Corinthians 14 is not referring to a Bible class. He's talking about when you come together in the assembly, beginning in chapter 11 and going through there, so we understand that. But any place that a woman would dominate, would take the ascendancy, she'd be out of place. I've known of women who sat on the back row in a Bible class and tried to dominate the Bible class and take it out of the hands of the teacher. I understand a well-known brother years ago in Fort Worth was teaching, and this woman just kept dominating, and so he just said, I'll tell you what, you come on up here and I'll go back there where you are, so you're teaching it anyway. And that kind of stopped all that. So we're talking about principles now. Is it wrong for a woman to ask a question or to answer one that's thrown out generally? Well, is she usurping authority over a man? Not if the teacher asks the question. And I mean, I think we've got to apply some principles there. And that's evidently what they're talking about. I want us to get to one or two other points here, but I'd like especially for us to have a little discussion. How much time do we have, Eddie? Well, we're doing good then. That's good. All right. 20 minutes, because he's going to have something to say. Uh-oh. I'd like for us to have a discussion here for a few moments how older preachers could help younger preachers. And I wouldn't mind some younger preachers saying, here's the way some of you older preachers could help us. But I think that's worthy of our discussion. I believe it'd do more good than a whole lot of other things we've discussed. So let's open that up now. What are some ways that we can help? Yes, Brother White. If y'all would walk toward the microphone too, it would help us here on time-wise. We get more people involved.
Michael White mentioned it in the lesson that I did, how I appreciated the men that I was able to study under who took the time out to answer questions and talk to me. And I mentioned specifically you, and you probably don't even care about me saying anything about it, but you asked the question, so you talk to me like a father would talk to his son. You're there when I call, when I have a problem, when I have a question, when I just want to talk. You don't let me talk too much, but usually but you do listen, and you're always there for me. And the things that you write in books, they're not copyrighted. You say used to the glory of God. Some men, if I were to quote like several times I do you, they would want to write me up and everything else in the world. I think that at least. They don't want us using their hard work material. But that's what I appreciate about you. You're willing to use what you find in the Bible. You're willing to let other men see it and use it if it's true and if it can be taught and be used. Other men that I have that I can call up and it's not like you're bothering me. That's what I appreciate. I think that's why I feel like I'm a strong Christian today and why I feel like I can preach the Word, because older men they care about me. And I know it. I can call them any time of the day or night, and they'll listen and they'll help me if they can. If anybody can be of service to young preachers, it needs to be older preachers. Just open up their whole lives to us and let us drain from them. Let us drink from them. Then I hope to be able to use that same example to other young men as well.
Right. Well, one thing, too, that I think we're always prone to forget is the good it does older preachers to have the confidence and friendship of younger preachers. That's invigorating. That's you can see why Paul and Timothy had such a wonderful relationship. That's great. Yes. Brother Stahl.
You asked for specifics, and I want to say that during the past 2 or 3 years, it's been my privilege. I'll just say I'm 70 and won't go into other qualifications. But over North Richland Hills in the Wyatt's Cafeteria, they have a preacher's meeting of men of this area. But the beautiful part of it for me is the hour and a half ahead of that, when we do meet with all the way from old uffers like me, members, preachers, I won't mention the old ones, but some of the nicest, finest young men come into that meeting. We have an hour and a half of Bible study, and we take it apart, and we discuss it. And through the years, I know if it is so helpful to me and so encouraging to see these young men and their ideas and their thoughts. And then once in a while, somebody steps on it. But on the other hand, too, they raise me up and encourage me. And I think the association, the get-together, the talk about it. We used to do it in the living room, like you say, when we as kids, we listened to the preachers. But I don't think that the preachers get together too often. I can't figure out why. I'll just talk about them a little bit. To eat and shake hands, and sometimes hypocritically. But I don't think that often enough they get together, regardless of age and status, and study God's Word, and I think this will really help.
Very good. There's been too many preachers' meetings for social things and not enough for study. Some of the richest times I've ever had is when about, well, as many as we get together, 10, 12, 14, we'd meet about once a month, and we'd study for 2 or 3 hours, and everybody that came had a part in it. We found out, for instance, 2 or 3 young men knew more Greek and Hebrew and better in word studies than all the rest of us put together. They'd specialized in that, and it was rich as cream. I never went to one of them, but what I learned a whole lot of things. And I believe that if we had more of this type of thing between older and younger preachers, where we pooled our resources, as our brother just said, would be a very, very wise thing. That's a good comment. Appreciate it. All right? Anybody? Here we have one down here that hadn't spoken yet, Richard. We'll get you too. Brother Davidson.
Harold Davidson from O'Bine. My sincere belief that every congregation ought to be a preacher training school. I do not hold this up as an example for any reason. But every congregation that I work with, we have, I call it an FBI class. Anything big enough to sit up and take nourishment through the 5th grade every Sunday night, 15 minutes before worship. Have a Timothy class of boys who've obeyed the gospel. Now, when I'm gone, away in meetings and lectureships, there's 3 young men that have been through this class that preach. When I'm gone, I give them books and open up my library, give them notes, give them sermons. And I got this from Brother Guy Woods. He said, here's the 80 best books that you ought to try to get. He helped me like a father would help a son. Every congregation needs to be a preacher training school, and the preacher be unselfish and train these other people.
That's great. And that's so vital, so important. Anyone else? Richard.
Andy Kaiser, Howe, Texas.
Oh, I'm sorry. I thought that.
That's all right.
He moved and you took his place. All right. Y'all look a lot alike. He's prettier than you are, but no, it's quite.
It's all right. I want to answer your question now. An older preacher can help a younger preacher because of the way I've been helped. I moved from here to Howe about 7 years ago, and when I got there was an older man in the community that you know, Brother Ramsey, Mickey Blake. He'd been preaching for more than 50 years and was semi-retired and was a member of the congregation there, and he was working in the interim and preaching and did a lot of preaching. And when I went there, the elders were saying, well, now, Andy's our preacher. He'll be in the pulpit, and Brother Blake, you're the associate, or you fill in or whatever. And, you know, a lot of older preachers wouldn't like that, and they'd probably find somewhere else to go or have a bad attitude about that. But Brother Blake's attitude was super, and that's just exactly the way he wanted it, as far as you could tell by seeing him. And the way he helped me was always very encouraging. You know, a lot of people will say after we preach a lesson, that was a good job, good lesson. And that's okay. We appreciate that, but it's more encouraging. He was more encouraging. He would come and he'd say, I appreciate that good lesson because of this point and that point and the way you said this and you brought this out. And he was very analytical in a very positive way. And so that was always encouraging. He gave me a lot of books, too, from his own library, which was very encouraging to me and very helpful to me. But there are two things that were most helpful to me as an older preacher to a younger preacher. Number one, he always studied, and he's still always a student. He's almost blind. He can just hardly see anything, and yet he edits our bulletin every week, and I help him print that because he can't see, but he always edits it, and we work together on that. But he's always the student, and he comes to me very often, almost every week, and he says, give me some background on this word in the Greek, or do a word study on this for me. And, you know, to say that I might be able to help him, I may not know anything at all about that, but I'm sure going to work hard on that just because he came to me in that way and asked me. And then another thing, after I'd been there a couple of years, he came to me after a sermon I'd preached on one occasion on one Lord's Day that he really didn't appreciate very much. And we'd been visiting the hospital together, and on the way back to the office from the hospital, he said, Andy, that sermon you did yesterday, he said, that was mean. That was low down, sorry, awful. And he helped me. I appreciate that, you know, but it was because of all that he had done before. But he loved me enough, and he cared enough about me to come to me in that spirit, in that way, and say something like that too.
That's
so
good.
we've worked together for 7 years and had a great relationship, and he's helped me out a great deal in those ways.
Appreciate that contribution to this discussion very, very much. I guess we have time to discuss this last point that we mentioned. How can we develop less suspicion and more brotherly love toward one another? One more time, we're not saying whitewash error, overlook sin, fail to point out that which is hurting the cause of Christ. We're talking about maybe attitudes, personal relationships, the concept of looking as hard as we can for the good. If we looked as hard for the good as we did the other, maybe we could accomplish more. Let's have a little comment on that, pro or con. We're not, you state what you believe that could help us, or maybe tell why this almost is essential nowadays to be very alert. We understand that, being alert against error. But what can we do to have a balance here in being alert to error and yet still deeply in love with our brethren, and try our best to make for peace, things that edify and make for peace, Romans 14:19. Any comment in this regard? Let's see if there's anybody else, and then I'll be happy to. If you can do that. Thank you very much. Next.
That was pretty brief, wasn't it? Well, it looks to me like it's the nature of what the problem is. For instance, one person was speaking not long ago, talking about ethics, said that everybody thinks philosophically, and whether it's ontologically or existentially, it has to have a lot to do with how far down the road they are on criticism. Well, when somebody's like that, I don't see much hope for the fellowship with that particular doctor. He has a doctor's degree. What can we do? But if somebody just has a different opinion, they feel differently about something that is not a matter of scriptural, especially liberalism, that, you know, it's different. I think we have to weigh everything a little bit.
That's a good point. We must make a distinction between opinion, judgment, emphasis, and that which is out and out error, that which is untrue. that which sows the seed of error in the body of Christ. All right, Mike, a brief one there.
We've got to know each other. Somebody who'd be listening to what you're saying might be thinking, well, Johnny Ramsey's getting soft. You know, he's mellowing out in his old age. But knowing you, I know that's not true. We've got to know each other. I made the mistake recently of asking another brother about another brother, and he says, why don't you call him and find out? Well, I called him, and I got to know him a little bit better, and it just wasn't the case. We've got to know each other as brothers, as preachers. If we don't, we're going to be suspicious about anything and everything.
That is a good point, good observation. Now, please again understand that after you know, get Brother Martin there, a microphone from Jamaica. After we get to know people real well, it's still possible for those people we know well to teach error. We understand that. Yes, Brother Martin.
Cliff Mars in Jamaica. There are two words I'd like you to have a discourse on in respect of the same matter, and this is the word love with its total denotation and connotation, its real meaning in relation to the topic, and also the word empathy as it relates to love. If we could have a discussion on that, maybe we could get the answer to it.
That's outstanding. Brother Martin's one of the finest men I've ever known. Hadn't been a member of the body of Christ very long, was one of the most discerning, perceptive men that I've ever met. And others who know him and work with him in Jamaica would say the same thing. He loves the Lord, no question about that. Of course, one part of love is to love the unlovely. That's really a definition of agape, the idea of God commended his love toward us, and that while we were yet sinners, Christ died for us. What if God hadn't had that kind of love for us? We'd be forever lost, wouldn't we? And empathy is even a deeper word than sympathy. We don't just feel sorry for someone else. We crawl into their shoes and try to see things from their vantage point. We empathize as well as sympathize. And really, that's what Mike was saying. You get to know somebody when you empathize with them. You can have sympathy with people you don't even know. You hear about someone who lost a loved one. They may be a neighbor 3 blocks around the corner from you. You don't know them from anybody else, but you immediately have sympathy for them because you think of how that'd be if it's your loved one. But if you really get to know them, then you can have empathy for them, and that's something that's very vital, very important. Brother, I believe you've hit on one of the key points. We need to realize we're not perfect. We make mistakes. And sometimes it's a matter of semantics. We take words that might not even mean the same to us as to others. And we need to get at the heart of the matter. Does this brother love the Lord? Does he love the church? Does he love the Scriptures? Does his life, Jesus said, by their fruits ye shall know them, does his life over many years prove that he does? Then there must be a misunderstanding. Maybe I didn't hear him right. Maybe I didn't understand him. Maybe I'm at a vantage point and looking at this in a cross-eyed way. We need to look to ourselves lest we also be tempted, Galatians 6, 1 and 2. But let me put it this way, and I believe I'm really hitting on what my observation is. There are 5 billion people in the world. Very, very few of those are New Testament Christians. And fewer still of those who are Christians are those who are conservative, biblical, who really want to do what's right. If I were the devil, I'd do my best to work in amongst that last group and fracture them, divide them, sow seeds of suspicion, belittle, be negative toward the brotherhood, because there's the devil's most infamous work. We know he works in the open, overt wickedness of a rebellious world. We know he works in denominationalism. But if he can get inside the army of the Lord and cause division, he's done his most heinous work. I don't want to give the devil any encouragement. I'm going to work to my utmost to salvage every brother and hope he's working on my behalf in my direction too at the same time. Again, after all of that has been expended, it is still possible for men, as Brother Hope said this afternoon, to apostatize, to allow sin in the camp, and then we must be sure to deal with that. But it'd be a great thing if we could restore the erring brother, wouldn't it? Wouldn't we want to restore the erring brother? Wouldn't that give us cause for rejoicing? Must we prove our soundness by ostracizing ourselves from others and pushing others out? So I really do believe, Brother Martin, you've hit two great words there. What does the Bible say about love, and what does it say about empathy? And if we got to know one another more, we could do a lot more good. Has Eddie already left? Well, Eddie. I've been trying all these years when he comes up here for him to sign a response card, and he won't do it. But you're getting sneaky in your old age. Appreciate it, and boy, I believe in prayer because I've lived through this session. Thank you.